Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session about the Turkish press. Let me introduce myself. My name is Andrew Finkel. I'm a journalist who's been based in Turkey for a good number of years, writing for both the international and the Turkish language press. My colleague Yavuz Baydar is the winner of last year's prize here in Perugia, winner of the European Press Awards, a former ombudsman in the Turkish press. Together, and with some other colleagues, we're also the founding members of something called P24. You can see behind you. P24 is an idea whose time has come, maybe an idea whose time has come too late. It's an organization which we helped to found to support editorial independence and press integrity in Turkey. This is a commodity which we feel is under grave threat. And we have various strategies which we engage in to try and do this, which we can talk about in good time. Let me just begin briefly, and I'll ask, this is a good opportunity for Yavuz and I to have a quarrel in front of people, people we don't know, instead of fighting among ourselves, which we normally do. Let me just throw out a few ideas about the Turkish press. My sort of, the simplest way of introducing the problems we solve is to narrate my career writing for Turkish language media. My first proprietor was arrested for petty fraud back in the 1990s. My second proprietor was arrested for sort of major fraud, as was my third. And yet, for odd reasons, we think of those days as somehow a golden period, that the situation now is in many ways much worse than it was when newspaper proprietors were simply leveraging the influence of their newspapers for interest in non-press sectors. Because in order to leverage interest, you actually had to be producing media. You had to be producing a newspaper which people wanted to read. Now, the situation, I would say, is even worse than that, where press ownership is so concentrated in the hands of people who are doing business with the government that they don't actually even show much interest in the media that they're owning, that they regard that ownership is more or less a tax, a forfeit which they have to pay in order to do business with the government, so that you have a large concentration of the media in the hands of people who neither care about journalism or media or indeed integrity, and are simply owning these newspapers, owning these television stations in order, as a forfeit, as a price to be paid to doing business with the government. Now, this creates, to try and sort of link this incredibly unpalatable fact with, the interest of this whole festival. I mean, what people have talked about in session after session after session is, the changing dynamics of media, the changing dynamics of press ownership, the changing dynamics of how you can create a bottom line in a digital age. Well, in a curious way, the Turkish press has solved this problem, because no one really expects to make money out of media. In any case, you make money out of construction or in all the sort of non-press businesses which you own, and you simply have the media as I said, as a tax on your other earnings. However, this creates a huge obstacle for independent media which wants to do the right thing, for journalists who want to do the right thing, because it's not, there's all these global trends which we as a journalistic community are trying to come to terms with, but at least, it's a level playing field. These are market forces which we understand and are maybe afraid of, but at least we know what they are. But the situation in Turkey, and of course Turkey is not unique in this respect, it's not so much a level playing field as a sort of playing field on a sort of 85% angle. In other words, how can you as an independent organization survive against media organizations which really don't care about the bottom line at all, don't really care about traditional finances at all. So that's the problem which we try to grapple with. And I'll turn the conversation over to Yavuz, who will say, perhaps go into detail about how this happens.
Well, why are we here? Why do we talk about Turkey? Why do we talk about Turkish media? And suggest that it is a very important story of a journalism in a country such as Turkey. The answer is very simple. I mean, we have to establish that first, because we are talking about a very big, large country, eastern flank of Europe, negotiating with the European Union for membership, and has done some progresses and advances in terms of meeting the Copenhagen criteria, and part of NATO. But not only those, it's been traditionally, since the Second World War, part of more than 30 Western institutions, which is linking Turkey to the Western system in terms of institutionalized relations. When it comes to the volume, importance, as I said, placement in the eastern flanks, eastern port of Europe, if you will, plus a diverse society which has been very turbulent in its history of counter dynamics, parallel dynamics, whatever you call it, in terms of making advances. Not so successfully perhaps, but still very turbulent and buzzing in terms of pushing for advances and fighting against counter dynamics of oppression, dictatorship, despotism. And everything takes place in the background of widespread intolerance as part of the culture. If you look at the parliament, 4 parties, 550 deputies, most of whom, if you perhaps distinguish the tiny Kurdish party, the rest basically infected by intolerance for dissent. This has to do about the intolerance and restricted allergia for objections, differences of opinion. This has been going throughout the history, even in the main opposition. If you look at the history, most of the restrictive laws that's been passed in the parliament in the past decades up to now has been more or less as products as a result of some form of compromise between the powers, governments, and the opposition. So this is a very sort of complex society, a very contradictive in its nature way of managing the country. And despite that fact, the very core of journalism, more than 160 years of hardcore journalism tradition, which had its own bright periods, although very little, it's been a country that has to be paid attention because as opposed to some other Eastern European or Caucasian or Middle Eastern countries or North African MENA countries, whatever happens in Turkey, whatever is happening now, whatever will be happening in Turkey in terms of freedoms and rights, will have consequences into Europe, into the region, Middle East, etc., etc. That's why I think this explains why there is so much attention from international point of view and why there is so much internal infighting, if you will, about these freedoms. So this is the background, this is the main big picture. And as I said, there have been some relatively bright periods in the 150 plus years of the history of Turkish journalism, one being the period between 1908 through 1912, first after what we call first constitutional reform, where all the diversity, freedom, independence, right before the First World War, what was happening. Second relatively bright period, I would argue, was after the First World War, between 1999 through 1923, where despite the occupation of Istanbul by the British forces, the press there enjoyed immense diversity and pluralism. And this has been a controversial issue, but it has enjoyed freedom. And then third period came after long periods of tradition, the oppression, in what we call the first period of the ruling Justice and Development Party period, between 2002 through approximately 2006 and 2007, where we enjoyed were sort of encouraged to hope that the things will change in terms of more widespread freedom for journalism. But that has stopped again, beginning approximately with the internet law passed in the parliament 2007 summer, when we had this big crisis about the presidential elections, the military issued the e-memorandum, etc. Up until in those 5 years, Turkish government seemed to have the dynamism for Copenhagen criteria, which meant, as part of the deal, to push for journalism as a fourth estate, as a facilitator of public debates, etc. But this finished. So what we are now facing is falling back to what I call factory settings again. Intolerance has recaptured the lost territory, and the fight against the freedom of the press was again flared up, based on a one-man's struggle, one-man's crusade, to use a very controversial word, against the journalism in Turkey. It is the current president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan's fight against what he sees as the abundant power that threatens his credibility, what he sees as his credibility, his reputation, his search for power. This has been mainly about Erdogan's struggle to silence journalism as a whole. And we saw, week after week, month after month, a deterioration of the situation. I will go into the details to that later on. There have been some thresholds, some turning points that made things worse. Why this was happening is, as I explained it to you, I would go also into details, but why this was happening is that it became more and more apparent that Erdogan had the goal of to grabbing the power. He began with gaining and controlling first of his party, which was collectively run between 2002 and through 2007 approximately. It was a group of people, which also raised hopes that the party would continue for the reforms. But he basically demolished that collective decision-making mechanism on top of the party, and presented or imposed himself as the sole decision maker, liquidating the people who would be potential threats to him, Abdullah Gül and other players in AKP politics. And to achieve even further power, further absolute rule, he had to push back whatever he saw as threatening segments of the media. And that began more or less after the latest general elections, 2011. That was the turning point. That was the beginning of the decline in that period. So what we see, and I will leave the word to Andy because he will have maybe other views about this, but what we saw from then on was in two phases. The first phase was to approximately giving some signals to attack groups of individual or groups of journalists, mainly on the leftist segment, jailed, legally harassed, or threatened, etc. What happened approximately from the attack in Roboski Uludere, the Kurdish village, where the fighter jets killed 34 civilian Kurdish people, smugglers, at the end of 2011, showed that now the assault to weaken and subordinate the media to government would continue with targeting not only single journalists or groups of journalists, but the institutions, outlets, media groups as a whole. And this became a pattern after more or less the early spring of 2012, a pattern that continues up to this day.
Well, let me sort of roll the problem back a bit in terms of the industry itself. I mean, I've been working in the Turkish press for, I don't know, it seems forever now, 25 years, let's say. And during the 90s, you know, this was a time when Turkey was recovering from martial law, when there was still this sort of authoritarian apparatus built into the constitution. Turkey had this wonderful constitution that was given to it in 1982, which meant that people were free to do anything they wanted, except in every particular instance where the state didn't want them to do it. So it was a sort of yes, but constitution. It was, yes, you are free to do everything, but no, you can't do it if I say you can't. So it labored under this enormous, handcuffs. And for those of us working in the press, this was a great problem. It was an even greater problem for me because if you're sort of, I wasn't born to this society. I didn't know where the red lines were. I didn't know where the taboos were. So, it was very easy for my colleagues to stay within the red lines. But for me, I thought these red lines don't apply to me. I'm foreign. I'm free. But of course, of course, they put me on trial in 1999 for 6 years for insulting the military. So in those days, things like the Committee to Protect Journalists, all these, powerful, good NGOs which are trying to make journalism a safe profession, very much pointed the finger at the Turkish state and said the Turkish state has this repressive apparatus and it's using this to control journalism. And, my conclusion, and I think yours at the time, was, you've got it all wrong. The people we need protecting from are not so much the Turkish state as our own newspapers, as our own proprietors, because these are people who are doing business with the state and are compromising the safety of their own employees, are not prepared to defend journalism integrity because they have a financial incentive not to do so. And so we were very much, at least in my case, my activism in those days was very much directed at my own profession and the way my own profession was handled. And I think the sort of irony is that by the time I had won that argument, it was no longer valid. In other words, by the time I had convinced people that in fact the real culprit was the journalistic industry itself, the problem, it was now the state, which was much more open in the way that Yavuz described, in trying to control its own supporters, in trying to control the airwaves, in trying to control public opinion through fairly, dogmatic, rough, unconcealed sort of set of restrictions. And so, I sometimes regret not having, having argued all those years about this. Now, I mean, I have my own periodization, which I think is slightly different from Yavuz's. In the 1990s, Turkey was a very strange place. It was, the strangest thing about it was that it had 70% inflation per annum. I mean, its annual rate of inflation was 70%, which meant that it's difficult to describe what this means, but it meant that people were financing the government deficit through inflation. And it meant that if you had any capital, you could just put it in the bank and make 10, 15, 20% real interest. So in those days, newspaper, if you were, in order to go out in Turkish society, in order to be well-dressed and presentable, you had to own a textile mill, a hotel, a newspaper, and a bank. And if you had a bank, even I could have been a banker in those days. You just took money from depositors, lent it to the government, and collected the rate in between. But of course, that system, on which the whole post-war political machine in Turkey was based, came to a sudden collapse in 2002. And in 2001, Turkey went through this incredible economic crisis. Interest rates went up from 70%, 80, 90% to 5,000% overnight. It was this incredible crisis. And it's no coincidence that no single political party which had been elected in the 1999 general election was re-elected in the 2002 election. So when you look at the rise of Tayyip Erdogan's party, the current president, when you see where his strength came from, it came from a sort of public sense of disgust with the previous system. And the point is that newspapers were part of that system, and they had, so this whole notion of society having a stake in freedom of expression, and et cetera, they had no stake, because the newspaper proprietors were themselves complicit in this system which was so corrupt and had collapsed so demonstrably in 2000 and 2001. Now, the thing is, if you owned a bank and a newspaper, the time's up. If you owned a bank and a newspaper, it meant that when that bank was seized by the government, because it was, you had banks going under with $1 billion worth of debt, $6.7 billion worth of debt, this in a sort of $180 billion economy. So, 36% of GDP collapsed in the banking system in 2001, and it's a huge figure. So it meant that the banking authorities seized the banks, but they also seized the newspapers, which were owned by the people who owned the banks, and of course to pay back the debt of the banks. So you had this great transfer of ownership at the beginning of this century from the old guard to the new guard. So all these newspapers, which had been owned by people supporting the old system, went to people supporting the new system, and not just newspapers, but television groups as well. So I would sort of date this transfer of power slightly earlier than you. So it was, and of course, the old guard had been very antithetical, had been very opposed to the rise of the current government, to Tayyip Erdogan. So he was more than delighted to see a transfer of these press groups from the old guard to his own supporters. And yet, but there was a sort of healthy competition even then between 2002 and 2007 between the media. But I think the other thing is, in 2007, the economy began to run out of steam. You had the Lehman Brothers crisis elsewhere in the world. Turkey's economy was growing by 5%. The system was righting itself. But Turkey recovered quickly from the Lehman Brothers crisis. It had record growth and 7-8% growth at a time when Europe was struggling. But even then, it wasn't clear where this growth was only coming from by fueling this consumption, by domestic consumption. So it wasn't really sustainable. And I think a sense of panic began to come into the government, and it sort of need to control, the perceived need to control public opinion became that much greater. And of course, this was at a time when media itself was changing. Suddenly we had these Gezi Park demonstrations where people were demonstrating against a government. with this whole notion of, this was an economy which exists in Istanbul by basically cannibalizing itself. Istanbul, I mean, when I first came to Istanbul, that many years ago, it was a city of 2 million people, and now it's a city of 17 million people or 16 million people. It's a city which grows, doubles in population in almost 10 or 15 years, and the rent from this expansion is really what was fueling this regrowth of the political machine. So in order to get its hands on that, you basically had to fuel this big consumption enterprise. Gezi Park was a reaction to that thing, to this process, and of course it induced a sense of panic within the government, that somehow the whole logic of its development was being threatened. It was even more threatened when there was a corruption scandal in the very heart of the government, when the ministers were discovered with counting machines in their houses because they had so much cash, shoe boxes full of cash in their houses that they actually needed counting machines to keep track of it. When this was revealed, and the government had this huge clampdown, and of course this is a time when social media was getting off the ground, when Gezi was, it was Twitter, which was, people in Gezi got their news not from newspapers, but from Twitter, from social media. Things were changing, so the government suddenly, which was able to control conventional media, legacy media, suddenly realized that in order to survive, it had to control social media as well. So instead of it being a country which imprisoned journalists, which it was a country which became notorious for banning Twitter. And we had a very major session yesterday about just how they went about doing that. So it's, they declared sort of war on social media, and they also sort of declared war on people who use social media. So if you were a practitioner of social media, it sort of almost branded you as being oppositional. And so, and now, within recent weeks, months, we've seen a whole raft of legislation which is designed to interfere with the way people gain access to the internet. So the government can take down a page, there was a story in the press today where they took down, what is it called, this thing which turns URLs into short, it's called Bitly or something?
Bit.ly.
Yeah. Bit.ly. Which shows what generation I am. They banned it accidentally because it was people were using it to gain access to pages which should have been banned. So they took down the whole damn thing, briefly for a couple hours. So as Yavuz said, and here I'll stop there. Turkey. What happens in Turkey matters. It's a big country. It's a big economy. It's an important place in the world, and it. At one time it had been an example of, a country which was getting out of this middle income trap, which was, had raised the level of welfare of its people from $2,000 to $10,000 and was on its way to $25,000. But now it's sort of stuck because it doesn't know how to deal with dissent, and it doesn't know how to deal with this sort of this new, brave new world, which we're all trying to make sense of how we get our information. Of course, that's where we come in.
Yeah, look how Turkey is perceived through the lens of the criteria of media, state of the media has been simplified. More or less what we have seen were the cliches of top jailer of the world. It was all measured by the quantitative analysis of how many people in jail, etc., etc. But if you put it in the context of the past quarter of a century, the past 25 years, what we see is, in a bigger picture, an emergence and consolidation of a dirty media order, what I call a dirty media order, corrupt media order, or an order where media ownership is becoming increasingly part of overall corruption. This is the very core of the decay of a sector that has been going on since early 1990s, in which the intolerance for journalism in terms of punitive measures, punishment measures, has been on display in terms of jailing people as well. But it has been deeper than that. The establishment of this dirty order started taking place, as I said, in early 1990s with many elements, but the sort of new sort of prototype media proprietor came in, and one of the first things they did was to chase out the entire trade union activity from the so-called mainstream segments of the media. Today, the percentage of the people, journalists in the core of roughly 15,000 people active throughout the nation is only 1.5%. The rest has been basically discouraged to become members of the trade unions. Trade unions have been weakened to nullification, and now they are trying to rise again. And the lack of job security, lack of collective rights meant, of course, a decline of editorial independence in the so-called mainstream media. Second element was also, despite all efforts, reviving or sort of re-establishing of our reference quality paper with some sort of reasonable circulation, like El País, La Repubblica, or Süddeutsche Zeitung type of newspaper in Turkish stage has failed. And the lack thereof, the absence of such news outlets also helped or caused or accelerated the deterioration. And again, coming back to the hope, the relatively brief period of hope that the sort of membership negotiations beginning 2004 with the European Union 2005 had raised also the hope with the additional element that the equivalent of RAI in Turkey or equivalent of BBC with the sort of national broadcaster with different bylaws, that it would be reformed, that it would be turned from national state broadcaster to public broadcaster in terms of helping accelerate the public debate so that the membership negotiations, reform process in Turkey would also accelerate. TRT, which is the national broadcaster, those efforts failed dramatically. Now TRT plus the semi-official Anatolian agency, their conditions are even worse than before 2002. They are now sort of Soviet-style propaganda machines of the government. For the first time in its history, TRT, which has a history of decades, 8, 9 decades, has been fined by a radio television supreme board. Despite the domination of the ruling AKP party, that board even could not tolerate the deep, sharp bias, pro-government bias in TRT in the election coverages. So I think these figures are telling enough of how dramatic the decline is. Let's look at the 4 criteria when we judge any country. We cannot just concentrate on the quantitative analysis of how many people are jailed in specific country X or Y. Although this is a criteria, this is not the sole criteria. You have to judge a country, the state of the media in any country, by 4 criteria: freedom, independence, diversity/pluralism, and safety. In terms of freedom, there was a period of dramatic increase of jailed journalists in 2009, 2010, and it was up to 104 at one point, of which the overwhelming majority were the Kurdish journalists, almost 85, 90% of them. And then this started to decline. This explains 2 things. The progress in Kurdish peace process, which meant the release of the Kurdish journalists and in a sort of showing the graphic downhill. Second, very clearly, recalculations at the level of Tayyip Erdogan, seeing that jailings of journalists, individual or groups of journalists, are causing headaches for the government. Unexplainable, Turkey being branded as top jailer of the world, or second top jailer of the world. And also it doesn't really, from his vantage point, help to gain more control of the media. There were and there are available other sorts of alternative punishment methods to silence not only individual or groups of journalists, but journalism as a whole, which meant, as became visible from Gezi Park protests, which not only were focused in Istanbul, but which spread to 79 out of 81 provinces in July 2013 through August. This meant that there was a core of honorable journalists from various ideological viewpoints who suddenly realized that they had to defend the basic values of journalism against their proprietors, against the government's brutal policy, etc. So this meant that in order to capture control over the so-called media, the conglomerate media, one could exert severe pressure through the ownership to fire journalists. A pattern that became very visible from July on led to mass firings or systematic firings of journalists from this mainstream segment, which is, according to the figures of trade unions, now over 1,500. This 1,500 is approximately 10% of the main journalist corps. But this is the core of valuable, sort of qualified human resource of a sector. And this was proving very fruitful, very useful for attacking not journalists, but journalism in a country where this conduct of the profession is becoming impossible, forced to nullification, and very, very useful and efficient. And that continued with the graft probes at the end of 2013, where the conventional media had no longer, in the conglomerate segment, 70%, completely silenced to reporting about it. And then everybody had to seek ways to report about it in the online media, which led to Twitter and YouTube bans. So pattern is very clear. About 95% approximately of the TV channels, which are the prime source of information, as in Russia, for the main public, is now more or less under control of the government, indirectly or by remote control or by direct control. And the print weaker in terms of effects, up to maybe 60–70% under control of the media. So this is where we are. And just before handing over the thing, I want to underline one thing. What you hear is, as I pointed out, the decline of jailed journalists is down to 7, according to Committee to Protect Journalists right now. It is showing maybe now about 10, according to CPJ. According to Reporters Sans Frontières, about 19–20, out of which maybe 85% again Kurds. This decline is worth to be noted, whereas the increase of the fired journalists is very sharp up. People don't find works anymore. Those who are fired are treated like intoxicated material. They are not rehired by the other proprietors, other bosses, because of the fear of oppression. And those are, as I said, leftist, social democrat. I mean, those people are sort of spread to wider spectrum. One final point is the counter arguments by Prime Minister Davutoglu or anybody from the government. You're seeing that, we have like 400 columnists attacking the government every day in this and this. Diversity arguments in terms of, saying that, government is criticized in a country. What are you talking about? Well, why are you saying that there's no press freedom? And the important thing is freedom of expression and freedom of the media are not the same thing. Freedom of expression is the midwife of freedom of the media, the riverbed on which the media freedom, press freedom flows. Freedom of the media is the mother of the freedom of the expression is the mother of freedom of the media. And this means that sheer opinion dissemination does not really cut it when you argue for existence of the media freedom in any country. What is being severely damaged in Turkey's case is that whereas opinion dissemination, columns, etc., are allowed, albeit under the threat of harassment, legal harassment, etc., it is the very core of journalism, which is reporting the facts, reporting the news, that is being really cut down to nullification. There is almost no investigative journalism in Turkey today. This explains, I think this should be the criteria, even more powerful than how many people are jailed in any country. In the Western Balkans, Southeastern Europe, and in Turkey, the lack of investigative journalism is telling enough about how miserable the state of press freedom, whose very core is reporting rather than opinion dissemination. Everybody's a blogger these days. I think that is something that we should look deeper into.
I mean, we don't have that much time left, and we'll obviously allow people to ask questions or make comments in a second. I mean, very briefly, very simply, it's, I mean, one of the dilemmas which we face is, well, we painted this very bleak picture, and of course you'll all go off and slit your wrists and, you know, commit suicide after this, I'm sure. But I mean, the question is whether the technological changes which are so much, you know, being discussed in over these last few days are on our side, whether somehow these can be used to harness, can be used to challenge sort of legacy media, which in Turkey has lost credibility, has, you know, collapsed. I mean, the circulation of newspapers has remained pretty much constant, I think, over the last 10 years. I think there's about 4.5 million newspapers officially sold in a country of 77 million. And those figures are probably exaggerated by 6 times. I mean, 6 times is not an unreasonable figure. So, I mean, you have oppositional press, but no one really respects media. No one really reads media. The question is whether it's possible to create alternatives to use the new possibilities to challenge the way people get information, the way people respond to events. And of course, we see that the battleground is being prepared because the government has created this apparatus which will allow them to control the electronic, the digital highways and byways. But maybe, are there questions, or are there people who want to ask things, or speak up, or have we sort of so depressed you that you'll just want to go and bury your head in the sand like we do?
We have about 10 minutes to go.
Are there? Yes, please.
When you mention Kurdish journalists, 2 small questions.
I think there's a microphone coming if you patient.
When you mention Kurdish journalists, I'd like to know if the Kurdish journalists always write in Kurdish, or if sometimes they write in Turkish newspapers with the Kurdish point of view. And I can't remember what the other question was.
I mean, there's a very small and not particular. Most Kurds, because of a culture of assimilation over the last however many years, that most Kurdish journalists write in Turkish and do their journalism in Turkish rather than Kurdish. What happened was that there was a great crackdown on sort of political activists within Turkey. There were a huge number of arrests in the thousands, and the point is, if you arrest so many people, chances are a lot of them will be journalists. So Turkey had the most journalists in jail, but they probably had the most bakers in jail too, because they were all taken in with this dragnet to sort of try and stop a sort of more or less a sort of campaign of civil disobedience in the Kurdish area. So there was a huge draconian roundup of individuals who were political activists, of which journalists were obviously well represented. But these were people writing in local media, national media, or sort of as much activists as journalists, perhaps, or if there is a difference between the two. Any other comments or questions? Yes.
Are either of you familiar with media in Malaysia?
No.
Media structures? Probably not. You wouldn't need to be.
I'm
But
sorry.
I don't know if anybody is, but it's what you're describing, the structures, the lack of respect or credibility, the sort of controlled by government in this odd, indirect way, high circulation, but nobody actually believes it. It sounds very much like Malaysia. And for different reasons, I think, but it's a similar kind of state-run TV media.
It's a good time to point this book. I mean, and not just Malaysia, but the Balkans. I mean, we're now involved in networks in Macedonia and places, whose populations I can see from my window in Istanbul. I mean, the small Balkan countries, but they all seem to have these same major problems in the press. And in fact, there are copies of a book, perhaps
I will
Yavuz would like to
introduce
talk
it to
about
you,
one of the Balkan networks, which we belong to, has produced this very comprehensive study about media integrity in Eastern Europe. And for those of you who would like to pick up a copy, please do. So yeah, you're right that it's not a unique circumstance. There was another question.
It was similar to the last one. So if it's possible to compare the situation, Turkish situations with others, but you already answered more or less.
The main core of why we are, I think, talking about this is that, as I said in the beginning, this is a country as opposed to Malaysia or Philippines or Venezuela, similar problems, but this country is part of the European court system, European Court of Human Rights system. This country is part of the, European enlargement project, and this country is still, against all odds, trying to, stay committed to the Copenhagen criteria, meeting the criteria. So the difference is there, and what we see is basically that the shift towards Malaysian criteria, shift towards Philippine criteria should be stopped, because those are, less discrete regimes in terms of how they approach to journalism per se, whereas the struggle here and discussions and the nature of the debate in Turkey is different.
Sorry, actually adding to the Malaysia question, in fact, some of the people from the government are quite close to the Malaysian model, let's say, so that deserves to be underlined. But in any case, an election campaign is now in full force in Turkey, and this will culminate 7th of June, is that correct?
Yeah.
And so are there any issues during the election campaign, apart from the Twitter interruptions, et cetera, about freedom of the press? Or is that totally swept under the rug as we watch it? And second question, do you feel that there is sufficient international concern by Committee to Protect Journalists, Journalistes Sans Frontières, etc.? And if not, what is the level of awareness that should be directed towards Turkey, and through what means?
The first question first. I'm not sure that press freedom per se has become an election issue yet, or the campaign is just sort of cranking up. It hasn't gotten underway. But I think certainly, what a lot of people see this election about is a last chance to preserve fundamental rights and liberties within Turkey. That if the government gets the supermajority that it wants to get, if it's able to sort of amend the constitution at will, this is unlikely, but it would need a huge vote in order to do this. If it gets these sort of superpowers, that it will use those powers to create a system in which, you know, it would be foolish to even think about fundamental rights and whatever. Another issue of the election is again, whether the Kurdish parties will get over this. In Turkey, there's a 10% threshold. It's the don't system, which is used in many other European countries. But the peculiarity of the Turkish system is that a party has to get over 10% in order to qualify for any seats at all in the parliament, which is designed really to exclude a regional-based party or a Kurdish party from getting into parliament. The Kurdish is now poised to get over that 10% and to establish itself. If it doesn't establish itself, then we will probably see some campaign of civil disobedience. So the election campaigns, normally once, you know, has a sort of rough period up to the election happens, and then life goes back to normal. I think now in Turkey we'll see the election as the new normal will be. We don't expect the election to solve these issues. The other question was whether international bodies concerned with press freedom are doing enough. I think there was a certain complacency in you know, maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, where you know, there was a sense that here was this new government that wanted, you know, freedom of expression for its Islamic followers, but put that in the context of a general democracy package, that it wanted freedoms for everyone, not just itself. But I think, you know, what we've seen is, you know, this sort of Lord of the Rings phenomena in Turkey, where, you know, the government inherited these huge draconian powers from the previous regime. You know, it's like the ring of power. You know you should throw it in the fire, but when you put it on your finger, it feels pretty damn good, and you don't really want to take it off. And indeed, they put it on their finger, and now they want even more power. So I think, you know, the international bodies have woken up to this. We have ourselves participated in, you know, Freedom House reports, various. You know, I think certainly the European Parliament, people have woken up to the fact that what's happening in Turkey is, as Yavuz says, that there is this sort of very dramatic struggle going on to preserve basic rights. So, but again, you know, Turkey. You know, the people talk about the curse of oil, how countries have, you know, they have these vast petrochemical wealth, and this becomes not a blessing but a curse. You know, Turkey has the curse of strategic significance. It's not the curse of oil; it's the curse that it inhabits a very important part of the globe. So it's governments are circumscribed in how critical they can be of Turkey because they need its cooperation.
It's the last, as far as I can see, pessimistic as I am about my observation the past 3 decades, last attempt to survive of Turkish media, given the context of the elections coming up in June 7, where we have now a media more forced to self-censorship than ever before. It's turned into a culture, daily practice, completely internalized, turning the entire mainstream newsrooms into open-air prisons, where basically editors and people who are producing the content are acting like medieval serfs in that system. So this is going to cause immense pressure on the test that Turkish journalism faces. I'm not very optimistic about this, because pressures are so high that the coverage, fair, balanced, diverse coverage of the entire spectrum seems impossible. It will be media will be the most visible battlefield for striving towards despotism, and most probably its backbone will be broken. And as Andrew said, it's impossible to see the way out. And the only way out would be perhaps to seek some sort of voices in online journalism, mobile, social media, etc., etc. But as I said, this is the final test, and the gloomy picture doesn't seem to have any way out right now from today's perspective.
However, the gloom will come to an end because our time is up. So now you can be cheerful.
One final thing: these books are available to you. These are from Balkan colleagues talking about similar problems in Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, etc. Please take them. It's very useful material. It's produced by them, and talking about basically where the hell journalism is going in Southeastern Europe.
Okay. Well, thank you for your attention.